Man, listen to that theme. So solemn, so quiet, so melancholy. A perfect representation of my feelings on this god-forsaken, disappointing, unimpressive waste of an amazing story. Why? Oh, why could this not have been a fucking anime? Sorry. Lost my composure for a moment. As you can see, this game was not exactly what I expected. But despite that, today we're reviewing Fate Extella the Umbral Star, developed by Marvelous Entertain... Okay, we can start this review on a good foot because Fate Extella's story, in my personal opinion, is wonderful. You play as the main character from Fate Extra. Yes, that means Extella is a sequel, but not exactly. Anyone who's played Fate Extella will notice early on that characters reference events from Fate Extra that do not exactly line up with the game. This is because despite being a sequel, Extella takes place in an alternate timeline version of the events of Extra. As a person who didn't finish Extra, this took me a little bit to figure out, but this has the beneficial side effect of making it a game that does not require playing the prequel in order to understand events. It helps, but is not necessary. Anyways, the game starts up by showing you a huge monster burning the very earth itself and doing a tutorial stage before jumping into the intro movie. And at first I wasn't really feeling this OP, but after completing the story, I understand that much like the title screen theme, this OP is showing that the story is not some simple hack and slash shonen anime game, but a more drama central story with equal parts joy and sorrow. But going back to the main character, you are immediately faced against some strange creature while being instructed by another shadowy figure before suddenly waking up to face the #1 waifu of the Fate franchise.
やっと目覚めたな、我がマスターよ。うなされていたようだが、夢見が悪かったのか？
Real talk. Again, I didn't beat Extra, but for the portion I did play, my character was Caster, and as much as I love my fox waifu, Nero Claudius, the Red Saber, proved exactly why she is such a huge face in the Fate community. From her personality, to her combat, to her personality, she is amazing in this game. After some lore dialogue about the world to get you the player and a recently mentally inhibited main character up to speed, we are explained that you and Nero won the Holy Grail War, a war between several mages and their magical servants based off heroic figures of the past called servants. Having won the war, you and Nero obtained an item called a Regalia Ring that gives you absolute control over the digital world that Extella takes place in. Deciding that a tour of the land would help you get your mind together, Nero introduces you to your guards, showing several old faces from Fate Extra, and let me say this right now, these characters are underutilized by the story. Almost all the secondary characters do very little to contribute to the overall story or have interesting moments that happen off screen, and this is particularly bad for fucking Archer, who was a main character in Fate Extra, and an extremely important character to the franchise as a whole, but I guess he's lacking 2 important features, so I guess it's okay. Actually, the real reason he's not a main character in this game is fucking sad and it gave me feels. Back to the story. After some more dialogue where the main character discovers he can hide his body inside the regalia so Saber can fight without worrying about him, you get involved in your first training battle facing Elizabeth Batroni, a character who I really grew to like over the course of this game. Finishing the Duel of Idols, the game introduces yet another character, but this time it's a surprise appearance from Caster, aka Tamamo no Mae, one of the other servant choices in Fate Extra, and she's packing another regalia bundled together with another protagonist. Must have been a sale. See, the main character has actually been split into 3 parts representing mind, body, and spirit respectively, and each part has a servant. Funny enough, this actually gives some personality to the protagonist when previously he was mainly a player avatar. Nero's master mind is very romantic, with most of his lines showering her with loving praise and Nero basking in it the entire time. Tamamo's master soul is a literal doormat, passively allowing a hypersexual anti-hero Tamamo to do whatever she wants. And then there's Body, and his servant should be appearing any second now. There we go. Last but not least, this is Altera, and I'm not going to go into any detail on her as she is tied heavily to the story, but her and her master Body are the best parts of this game. Now, conveniently enough, the story is split between these pairs in 3 separate timelines, aka routes, much like the original Fate Stay Night, and I'll go more into those comparisons in the 3rd segment of this review, but overall the story from these characters started okay, but steadily built up as more and more of the lore was explored until I found myself unable to put the controller down, wanting to know how all these events would be resolved. That is an accomplishment because the story is hampered by both terribly bland gameplay and a less than stellar visual novel presentation. I'll talk more about gameplay in the next section, but the graphics while in-game look okay. In cutscenes, it feels like the developers were trying to find a middle ground, with the visual novel origins having text and sprites that show the characters' emotions, but the models acting out the scene tend to have a bland expression on their face that just looks weird when you notice it. And then there's that mouth thing again. The main characters are not the only ones with the story though, as all the characters have a mini story mode for themselves, functioning as a sort of what if scenario, allowing those underutilized side characters to have their own moments in the light. Speaking of side stories, one interesting part of the game is the ability to raise your relationship with the characters, and at least with the heroines of the game, have special scenes with them. A fun little feature that reminds me of dating sims, but not really fleshed out. Overall, I really liked the story. Really liked the story. Despite being kinda on the short side once you remove the gameplay time from the equation, the cast of characters the story chose to focus on is good. The plot got me invested, and the route endings just pull at the heartstrings. If only I could say the same about the combat, but alas, it is time to rip this game a new one. Onward to gameplay. Here we go. Obviously, as you can see, this is a Musou style game, so if you don't like these kind of games, this section is moot, so you can move on to the next one. But for everyone else, I kinda wanna say the same thing, because this may be the least enjoyable iteration of the Dynasty Warriors framework that I've ever played. The gameplay is the reason this video was so late, as I was immediately put off after playing the first stage and only returned 2 weeks later to play far enough that the story started to kick in and keep me going. With that said, let's break this down. First things first, the characters. Now the selection itself is pretty solid. This game features not only characters from Extra, but also the original, Zero, Apocrypha, and even Fate Grand Order, so that's pretty hype. But not all the characters translate into a Musou game well. Some characters fail to excite me with their playstyles for one reason or another, like Castor not having her mage/martial arts done well, or Ryder lacking good implementation of her abilities, or Iskander just kinda being boring. To be fair, one of the Musou genre's greatest weaknesses is its early game, because that's where the characters have the least amount of moves, and the farther you get in, the better the characters become, but there has to be a baseline of enjoyment in order to even want to go through the leveling process, especially since leveling kinda feels slow in this title. Now, funny enough, other characters do not have this problem, and characters like Nero, Altera, Archer, and even Elizabeth all feel at home in this game with wide hitting high movement combos, interesting animations, and things unique to this game like jump cancels that drag enemies into the air with you for combos, and dynamic camera angles for some normal attacks. Not to say that other characters don't have these features, but some characters definitely got preferential treatment. Moving on to the maps, instead of an open map to explore, you have maps composed of several areas of varying sizes, and you need to take over enough of them to fill the gauge at the top and summon the boss. Despite the stage themes being few in number, there are a lot of maps since they can just arrange them in different ways. Most stages are fairly large all things considered, and while normally that would be a good thing, the game tends to throw objectives super far away from you, requiring spam dashing across the entire map in order to reach the required location. Taking over areas is fairly easy. Just beat up the regular enemies till the commander unit shows up and kill them. Voila, map piece obtained. The basic commanders are almost identical to regular units, but later in the game, giant commanders start appearing and they require you to move out of their attack range lest you take a sizable chunk of damage. Aside from commanders, there are also mini bosses called plants that spawn in areas you are not in and send officers into other areas of the map, and you have to kill them quickly lest you lose all of your areas one by one. I hate these enemies as they make me feel less like an amazing warrior and more like a janitor, constantly picking up trash only to notice more trash appear elsewhere. I feel so powerful. As you fight, you may notice areas on the map with elemental signs next to them. This means that there is a trap in the area and it can randomly activate when you're in the zone. These traps are so one-dimensional it hurts, literally, because if you don't have the proper skill equipped when the trap activates, boom, 90% of your life free with no ways to avoid it. Trust me, I've tried every method I could think of to avoid the damage, but no dice. Hell, leaving the area and returning doesn't work as the trap simply waits for you to return even if the trap was activating when you were leaving.
What?
Now let's talk about the bosses, aka the servants. Much like everything else I've talked about, there is nothing really exciting about them, and that's a shame because servant battles are one of the main appeals of the franchise. But here it's simply wail on them until they block, and then wait because attacking anymore at this point is useless. And the only way you can break their guard is with a move available only to the transformed forms of the three main characters. Yes, only 3 characters can break a guard, and it's exclusive to a form that takes a while to charge up and is only available for a short period of time. It's just as dumb as it sounds and makes servant battles a chore. There are a few abilities the player can use in order to make these fights go faster, such as Moondrive, Extella maneuvers, and Noble Phantasms. Moondrive is a power-up ability available to all the characters and is pretty much just a damage and defense boost, unless you are one of the 3 main characters who gets a transformation and a different moveset that includes a guard break attack, which is actually pretty cool, but again limited to only 3 characters. Extella maneuvers, or EMs on the other hand, are available to everyone and have your character dance around the playing field, dealing damage to all enemies as long as you continue to spend your EM gauge. Looks pretty cool and even has a fancy ending animation, but man, watching this sequence gets old after the 100th time, and the game doesn't help by making it easily available and most of the time a more useful way of fighting harder enemies than just attacking. Finally, there is the Noble Phantasms, the ultimate ability of a servant, and I have to say, dear God, these are trash.
NANI?
First of all, even to get the ability you have to run around the map to collect pieces of phantasm circuits, and once you have all 3, you can unleash an area clear attack. Because that's all these moves are. It's a fancy cinematic followed by dealing damage to everything in the map. Despite having such a diverse cast of characters, none of their Noble Phantasms have any real special properties, with the slight exception of Karna losing his armor and thus taking more damage for the rest of the battle, and Jeanne almost killing herself.
Wow.
but those mean little to me. What was the biggest disappointment was unlimited blade works, and I'll talk more about that in the next section, but to put it bluntly, I hated how noble phantasms were handled in this game. So the mobbing is good, the move lists are bad, the bosses are bad, and the ultimates are bad. 1 out of 4, so let's take a look at the customization. Which is meh. You can equip a variety of mystic codes to your character, giving you spells to support your servant in combat, things like healing, damage ups, and even force activating their moon drive. I actually like this, but my 2 main criticisms is the unnecessary crafting required to get them, and the fact that you choose your mystic codes before you choose your map. Meaning if you need to have a specific resistance spell for those BS traps, you have to look at the map, then backpedal through the menus to change your mystic code accordingly. That is more of a UI annoyance than a problem, but moving on to the other customization option is the install skills, modifiers to servants themselves that give them various passives like chances to ignite enemies, increase their raw stats, or increase the rate they build various gauges. You get more slots to equip things by spending time with your servants and completing their optional challenges during maps, but it's not all that impressive, and I ended up equipping the same items to all the characters, barely even paying attention to it. Suffice to say that most of the core gameplay is passable at best, but then something happens when you reach the end of a route.
See, now I'm interested!
Really game? Really? This boss fight at the end, while not anything spectacular, was actually fun and had some interesting combat ideas. Hell, let's shove all the fan service aside for a moment and talk about this boss. It has multiple stages, different attack options that require running and jumping to avoid, and even is only vulnerable to attacks at certain moments where you can unleash all your damage on it. This is the makings of a good boss encounter, and for fuck's sake, the final boss, or more accurately, the final stage, does away with the shit servant encounters and instead focuses on the mob combat, which is enjoyable, while throwing in some alternate gameplay moments and a spectacular visual presentation. I was awestruck in these moments, wondering where this was in the other areas of the game. Hell, I have a separate video showing my first reaction to the end boss and I was speechless. And it simply showed that there were ideas for this game, they just didn't make it to the core and most played parts of it, sadly. So in summary, the most played parts of the game are only okay at best and disappointing at worst. Most characters are fun to simply mash buttons on and build a kill count, but the second you throw an enemy servant in the mix, that fun goes out the window. The only areas that really show some promise are the route's final bosses, but as cool as they are, that's just not enough to compensate for what you will be doing 90% of the game. So now let's move on to the miscellaneous section, and for this game we will be talking about how quote unquote fate this game is. Okay, here we are, and let me explain what I mean by being fate. But first, for the most part, this section is mainly geared at people who know about the Fate series, so those who don't may be lost with what I'm going to say. Sorry about that. Now, as far as what I mean by being Fate, I am simply saying how much does the game translate parts of the original visual novel into a video game form, and I accept that not everything can be translated perfectly or even translated at all. Hell, the OG Fate Stay Night was a freaking eroge.
I am the pawn of my soul.
But when it comes to games based on other franchises, I personally expect some level of dedication to the source. Speaking of eroge, let's open up with that, because it was oddly one of the things that stood out to me. Other Fate adaptations kinda dance around the topic of sex, like how the animes replaced the scene with the infamous Mana Dragon. Every route, if you build up your relationship with your servant, is rewarded with a more fan service oriented scene that, depending on where you hit that relationship requirement, can feel really out of place. And Castor in particular is so devoted to her perfect wife/harlot persona that it is all but written in red ink on your screen that they fucked at some point. Though in context, unlike a lot of Fate's admittedly ham-fisted erotic moments, these have more logical explanations, like genuine love for each other, the end of the world coming, and bodily impulses for each pair respectively. Moving on to what many would say is far more important, we are going to talk about the servant abilities. I really felt that some servants were not properly represented in this title, with many of their abilities either nerfed, altered, or outright not included. Characters like Lancer, whose Noble Phantasm is incredibly simple for such big battles, while keeping the ranged version as a normal move, they actually changed the Noble Phantasm into some sort of unimpressive area attack that kinda looked bland, not to mention the healing debuff not being present in his attacks. A more interesting example is Ryder, whose Bloodfort Andromeda is present as a stage ability in the story mode, but the playable version is a heavily nerfed attack ender. An even more interesting case is Caster herself, who originated from a Fate video game, not an anime, but despite this, her Noble Phantasm is just another massive damage move instead of a buff like it was in Fate Extra. But the most disappointing example had to be Archer's Unlimited Blade Works. Now to be fair, it's a move that almost no Fate game has done correctly, but I expected more from Extella when I first heard about this game. Let me explain. Unlimited Blade Works is a spell performed with an 8-line incantation and creates essentially a pocket dimension where the user can summon an unlimited arsenal of bladed weapons and less commonly shields. Now how does almost every game do this? Well, first they either skip most of the incantation or have Archer speak multiple lines at the same time. Second, they ignore the fact that individual parts of the chant can be used to empower his other moves, which would create more complex and rewarding combat options. And finally, once he's cast Unlimited Blade Works, all that happens is a non-playable cutscene and then Unlimited Blade Works ends. This one isn't even Extella's fault, as the only game I know to do UBW justice is Fate Unlimited Codes for the PlayStation 2/PSP, a fighting game where Archer has to recite each and every part of the incantation before sending both him and his opponent into an alternate world, giving him extra moves to fight with and combo, in addition to giving him a super that skewers the opponent with 100 blades like every other game does.
Yeah, those hands will never hold anything. So as I pray, unlimited blade works.
Truly, with an open combat environment, I was expecting a similar thing from Archer, but here, sadly, I was mistaken. Funny enough, characters like Elizabeth and Medusa have attacks with non-standard hack and slash gameplay, like creating projectile hearts that stay on the field even after you can move again, or command grabs where you throw enemies into other enemies, for each servant respectively, so there was potential for super unique fighting styles, but they just didn't. But moving on to the story, it actually reminds me of the original in terms of tone, not in execution, because the detective work involved in finding out who the enemy servant is not at all present in this game. Kinda surprising since its predecessor Fate Extra had that as a core gameplay mechanic, but anyways, what I'm talking about is the feel. The mood I got from the routes, it actually felt similar to the 3 routes of the original visual novel, with Saber lining up with Fate, Caster lining up with Unlimited Blade Works, and Saber again lining up with Heaven's Feel. One secret thing that I think should have been expanded into a core gameplay function instead of being an Easter egg is that you can equip certain install skills to characters that line up with their lore special traits, and you get a bonus from it, though mostly it's a measly +1, but if you maxed out the relationship with certain characters, they get a massive bonus to the last slot skill, the most impressive being Gilgamesh, and his item drop +99 because of his Collector EX ability. There really should have been more of that. But to summarize, Fate Extella does do more than just wear the Fate brand over a Dynasty Warriors title. It does put in some of the work, but admittedly not a lot. So with that said, on to my final thoughts. Fate Extella is not the game I hoped for, but it was the game I expected, as several people had told me before the game was ported onto PC that it was kinda bland even by Dynasty Warriors standards. For me, it came down to one question: how fun is it to run around and be a Fate Stay Night character in an action game? And for that, it was only okay with other games doing it better. Hell, one outside influence that kept sapping away time from this game was ironically the loot box filled Fate Grand Order that feels just as much like a love letter to the Fate fanbase as it does a slot machine that only wants my money. Must not buy St. Quartz. And if you have noticed, I've been referencing a lot of other games, and normally I try to restrain myself from doing that in reviews, but this game kept making me think of other games while I was playing it. I personally wish that the story could have been separated from the game and turned into an anime, or even ironically a visual novel, but it's not like the game is unsalvageable. Just a series of questionable design decisions that don't gel with me. There is, interesting enough, a sequel / side story in development, and Marvelous even emphasizes on the action gameplay being better, so I'm keeping hope alive for that. But as far as this game, Fate Extella, with the price at the time of the recording being $49.99, my final rating is a pass. First one for the channel, but outside of the story I could not find much enjoyment out of this title, and for most people a story can't carry an entire experience, especially at that price. But for Fate fans, I'd revise that rating into a deep sale. Because for people like me, this story was worth the read, especially after discovering that this story was written by the OG creator Nasu himself. But again, I'm saying deep sale, as anything even close to a $50 price tag is too much to justify playing a game not only just for the story, but actively ignoring the gameplay. And with that, we have reached the end of this review. Thank you to all my viewers for your support, and a special thanks to my patrons for financially supporting this channel, because obviously the big guys won't. If you want more reviews, check out the playlist. I'm slowly starting to accumulate a fair amount of these. Leave a comment with your opinions on the game, subscribe if you like my content, and even join the Discord to talk about random anime, eroge, and games. But with that said, I'll see you guys next time. Later!